On Life and Meaning is brought to you by Blumenthal Performing Arts, celebrating its 25th year presenting the best in the performing arts, sharing and employing the arts as a major catalyst to strengthen education, building community cohesiveness, and advancing economic growth. Further support is provided by Charlotte-Mecklenburg Library, one of America's leading urban public libraries, delivering exceptional services and programs with a mission to improve lives and build a stronger community. And by the Arts and Science Council, Charlotte-Mecklenburg's resource hub and lead advocate for the regional cultural community, providing culture for all.
Hopefully, that sort of family ethic will be passed along, and it's basically this. To me, it's not about money. If some of them didn't have any money, that's not really what it's about. I think what it really is about is being actively involved in your community wherever you happen to live, and really being part and giving whatever it is you have to give. And if that's money, that's great. But if it's not money, then it can be time, and it can be energy, and it can be your intellect. If you want to understand what makes a community successful, it's people that really care about it.
Philip Blumenthal is chairman and director of the Blumenthal Foundation, a family foundation established by ID and Madolyn Blumenthal and Herman and Anita Blumenthal that supports projects of significance in Charlotte and North Carolina. Philip is also director of Wildacres Retreat, a conference center located near the Blue Ridge Parkway in Little Switzerland, North Carolina. A lifelong philanthropist, Philip is the recipient of numerous honors, including the Order of the Longleaf Pine, Conservationist of the Year by the North Carolina Wildlife Federation, Volunteer Service Award by Partners for Parks in Charlotte, and Outstanding Philanthropist in Conservation by the Roosevelt-Ashe Society. In this episode, we explore philanthropy and grant-making, family legacy, and the obligation to give. I'm Mark Paris, and this is On Life and Meaning. Philip, welcome.
Thank you.
What is the Blumenthal Foundation?
Blumenthal Foundation is a private foundation that was established in 1953 by my uncle, ID, and his wife, Madolyn Blumenthal. And then my parents, Anita and Herman, were very involved in it. And that legacy has come down to us. So the trustees at this point, serve as the chairman of the foundation, and then my two brothers, Alan and Samuel, are also involved. They're on the board.
What does the Blumenthal Foundation do?
We support a lot of nonprofits. A lot of foundations restrict their giving in one way or another in an effort to focus. Our focus is not so much around issue areas as it is the geographic region. Now, that doesn't mean we don't do anything anyplace else, but the Charlotte region has been growing so much through all these years that we don't have to look very far to find other worthwhile or many worthwhile nonprofits to support. So we get involved in a whole range of issue areas, from art and environment and education and social services and health. We get involved in all sorts of things. And so in some ways it can look like there's not a lot of focus, but the focus generally tends to be around this geographic area. The other place where we do more is in the mountains, western North Carolina, near where Wildacres, the conference center, is located, because some of those counties are among the poorest in the state. And we have a presence up there, so we try to help some of those nonprofits in those counties where we are. And then we do some other things other places, but for the most part, the main focus is around here.
What are you hoping to accomplish with the grants that you give?
Well, everybody's looking for impact. Impact is a big word. There have been a lot of sort of catchy phrases or words that get popular one time or another, and so right now impact is a big one, and it is important. So what we're trying to do is help. We look at ourselves as partners. We don't do the work. We're funding organizations that do the work. So we also don't come into it, I would like to think, with a lot of arrogance about what the best way is to solve some of society's problems. Doesn't mean we don't have any ideas, but that's not where the main focus is. Those organizations live and breathe the work they do every day. And so we look at ourselves as partners with them. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to create a partnership where we can help them achieve, the good work that they're trying to do, whatever it might be, whether it's an environmental issue or education or healthcare or whatever. My father always said that the community had been good to him, and it was his responsibility, he thought, to give back to the community. And we've all felt that way. At the end of the day, we're trying to affect change. All these organizations are seeing problems, and they're trying to make things better in whatever way that is. And so that's our job, is to help them do that.
You can't fund everyone.
Right.
What guides your decision-making?
Our philosophy is this. We learned a long time ago, when you've got a limited amount of money, there are some particularly smaller nonprofits that it can be a smaller grant. It could be $2,500. It could be $5,000 or $10,000. Can be as important to them as, to be honest with you, $1 million grant might be to a really large nonprofit like a university or something like that, in helping them achieve what they're trying to achieve. Now, they may not be reaching the same numbers of people, but the point is, again, we're back to, are they being impactful in what they're trying to do, and is that something that we feel strongly enough in to fund? So the other thing we try to do sometimes is, if we can, is sort of get in early. If they're doing a campaign and it's organizations that we've supported for a long time, I know the way the game works, and I know that, you need credibility in what you're trying to do. And if we can help an organization by being an early funder of a program that they're trying to do, then we try to do that.
Many nonprofits, in order to attract money from foundations, will create a project or an initiative, and their operational funds starve as they chase foundation dollars with projects. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, we feel very strongly about that, actually. Yeah, a lot of organizations try to chase the money and try to approach you with something they think by reading your website that you'll be supportive of, or they may have reason to know otherwise. But we always have given operational support to nonprofits for the work they do, always, from the very beginning. So I inherited that when I first started running the foundation, and I've always felt, again, very strongly in, not that we don't fund special projects. And I mean, there's one risk, foundation, again, and corporate giving programs sometimes would rather do that because they look at it as, they've got a defined time limit of their support. So we'll give you money for either this year or for a 2 or 3 year program, and then we're sort of out. And we don't believe that way. We totally believe that these nonprofits, most of the people that work in them are overworked and underpaid. I know that because I know a lot of them. And we believe that, somebody's got to pay to keep the lights on and pay salaries. And we don't mind being the ones that do that. And so, again, a lot of times, and again, we may fund some special project that they come to us for, but that's not what it's all about. It's all about the work they do every day, not what they're doing, some new idea or some new project that they come up with. We're hoping that they're learning as they continue to do their work over the years, so that, if they come up with something that looks like a new avenue or something that might really work, then we'll take a look at that too. But the operating part of it is something that we have always done.
Your foundation has money. Organizations want the money. Is there a burden having money that other people want? Well,
it can be. I mean, the biggest thing is the responsibility that comes with giving it in a sort of, I won't use the word intelligent, be so bold as to do that, but doing it in a way where you've got accountability too. Because you can do a lot of damage if you just are, just giving money and not really trying to make sure that there is accountability, that the organizations are really talking to you. Again, that's back to sort of the honest conversation that you want to have. And that can be challenging sometimes. As many organizations as we work with, we try to see that much as possible that what we're doing is having the most impact that it can have.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've taken risk. You've had hits and misses. What have you learned about grant making over the years?
Well, I've just learned that it's an inexact science and that you do the best you can, and that number one, you try not to beat yourself up too much if something you funded doesn't work. And on the other hand, you don't pat yourself on the back too much when something you funded did work, because you're not the one that really did it in the first place. It was the organization that did it. So hopefully you can share in that success. And again, you learn. That's the thing, is at the end of the day, you hope you learn. And this is something else that's been talked about in the world of philanthropy forever. How do you take best practices? It could be in a subject matter, it can be in a different city, but you've got a lot of people. There's so many nonprofits, all over the country and all over the world. That's always one of the challenges, is figuring, okay, so something worked great in Seattle. Why couldn't we take that and bring it to Charlotte, for example, and have that work well here? And in some cases, that might be the case. And so I think the nonprofit world, too, has always been struggling with that, always been trying to make it better. It doesn't mean that they don't learn from each other at all, but I don't think it happens as much as it could.
Mm-hmm. Why should anyone give their money away?
because it's their obligation to. Most people didn't make their money all because of their own intelligence or even good fortune. Good fortune's usually got a lot to do with why a lot of people did well. They happened to be at the right place at the right time. They had the right support group around them to do well. And so a lot of people that have done really well, and we've got, as I said, in this community, whereas it didn't used to be that wealthy a community, there is a lot of money here now. And these people, they didn't make it all by themselves. And if they want the type of community that you would hope that they would want, one that's equitable and one where, again, the environment's important to me, we've got clean air and clean water and open space and all those type of things, it doesn't happen by itself, and it takes resources. So it's not all going to be. Government has certainly got a role, but government is never going to be able to do all of it, nor should it. And the corporate community plays a big part, you would hope. In Charlotte, it has in the past for the most part. But that being said, a lot of people, whether their money is going to come from sort of the corporate money that they made or whether it's going to come just from them as individuals, however they may have gotten their money, the way we look at it is that it's their responsibility to be involved. And it's not just their responsibility to be involved with their time. I mean, time's one thing, and it's great, and you should be giving your time to. But it's not that. It's also money. And all these organizations that really, to be honest, struggle more than they need to, we think should be supported, and they should be supported both with time and money. So, the answer to that is, if you want the type of community that we would think most of us would agree that we would want to live in and the quality of life that we want, it's only going to happen if people give of their time and money.
Giving out of obligation seems different than giving out of a spontaneous act of goodwill or charity.
Yeah, it is. There's no question that it is matter, but that's the way we look at it. Well, tzedakah, is a Jewish word, and a lot of people translate it. It's sort of the charitable giving, in Judaism, but the word really means, justice or righteousness. And so it really is a lot more than that. And it comes back to, as I said, for what I got from even my grandparents, who were very charitable in their own way. They came to this country with nothing and ended up really doing a lot in Savannah, which is where they lived. But then through my uncle, who was 21 years older than my father and had no kids, he was very much like our grandfather too, really like another generation, then to my parents and then to us. I mean, this has been sort of the heritage, that we grew up with. And so that's why I feel as strongly about it as I do, because I've seen it, and I know that it's really the only way society works. And so you're not being a nice person or a good person if you give to these organizations. You really should be doing it because it's what you should do. And so, yeah, you should feel good about it. I'm not saying you should just do it totally out of duty, because that's also one of the arguments. I'm also a big believer in giving while you're alive and not saying, it's all going to be good for all these organizations because when I'm dead and gone, they'll get all my money. I mean, I tell people all the time, because that's one of the things with the foundation we do is talk to people about trying to help them figure out ways to raise money. You don't want to be, as a nonprofit, sitting there reading the paper every day, looking at the obituaries, hoping that so-and-so died, so you finally get their money. Because if people will give while they're alive, they can truly begin to see what the joy of giving. And so they get much more than they probably, if they're not big givers, more than they would ever think that they would emotionally, if they will realize the importance of giving. It's one of the things that I talk about a lot, as a matter of fact, about the giving ethic in Charlotte. So that comes back to it too. I mean, one of the things that we have seen is that we think, we being sort of the foundation, that there needs to be a larger individual giving ethic in Charlotte. In some cities, you see where there's a lot of sort of families that have been involved for a long time, and there have been some here. So it's not that it doesn't exist at all, but Charlotte's gotten big enough now where there really should be a lot more individual money that you see. We see very few of the sort of transformative big gifts in giving in Charlotte. And there have been some, and hopefully we'll see more. But again, with the resources that are here now, there are a lot more people that sort of be in the game. And I think a lot of it comes back to developing and building a greater individual giving ethic where people, again, they really come to see it as, okay, this is my responsibility. I mean, I've got more money than I could possibly, use to live, and houses to live in, and places to go, and cars to drive. And it's like the community could use those resources. I think that there should be more pressure on people to give. So whether you want to call that obligation or call it something else, that's fine. But to me, again, I don't think that diminishes the joy that you can have when you do give. And I've felt for a long time, and I've talked about with different people around town. With the foundation, 25 years ago, we were talking about ways to try to help build individual giving. And there's an organization that started several years ago now in the main programs called Leadership Gift School, and called the organization the Institute for Philanthropic Leadership. And what that's all about is trying to help organizations get better at developing their individual giving, that resource. But there's no question in my mind that even if you feel it as an obligation, when you actually do the physical act of giving money to an organization and you become hopefully emotionally engaged with that organization, and involved with them, there's untold joy that you can derive from that. Whether you felt it was an obligation and you should just do it or not, and you were doing it only because you had to. You shouldn't feel that way about it, even if you feel that, it's my duty to give. Our family certainly never has. And to be part of those organizations and see the good work that they're able to do with the resources that you're able to help provide for them, there are few better feelings than that. I'm wondering what would it take to get some of these people that really have a lot of resources to be more philanthropic in the community? And I'm not sure what the answer to that is. I've thought that there are different ways you can approach it. Now, one thing like Leadership Gift School is trying to do is trying to help the nonprofit world be more systematic, if you will, in the way that they go about building the individual relationships. Because there's no question that just because somebody's got money, if they don't have a relationship with an organization, there's no reason they should make a major gift just out of the blue. So the organizations need to get better at developing long-term relationships with people. If organizations want to be successful long-term, they're going to have to invest in individual giving. I think roughly 90% of the money every year in this country comes from individuals. So how can you afford not to concentrate there when you're trying to raise money for your organization? But most organizations don't do it because it is time-consuming, labor-intensive, and it takes really a long-term plan of building relationships with people over time. So it needs to outlast the current staff of that organization, the current board of those organizations. But if organizations want to be successful long-term, that's what I think they need to do. I think the nonprofits have to get better at it. But I also think that the community needs to understand the importance and the role that the nonprofit world plays in the community, and what we would be lacking if we don't have a strong nonprofit world, if you will. So that's why, again, we've been talking about this, trying to look at different ways that you can engage people. I think maybe some of it could be social, and that's something we've actually talked about a good bit. And and it could be social pressure, if you will. That a lot of their friends and other people they know in the community are involved in this, and so it doesn't look so good if they're not. And so, because what I think is that people even that aren't habitual givers or just haven't given very much, if you start to give, I think it can very easily become habitual. And you can begin to see again, the joy that you derive from giving, and the good that it does in the community, even more so. And you begin to realize why it's important that you be involved. A lot of it's about people, and it's about the people that work in a lot of these organizations too. It's about the boards. That's one of the biggest problems, is that a lot of the boards don't understand that it is their role to help their organization not just survive, but thrive. And if that's going to happen and that's going to work, it's only going to happen with their help. If they don't care enough to both give, I know plenty of organizations that can't get all the board members even give, much less help go out and do fundraising calls. So the ones that really do well are the ones where the boards are actively engaged. It's really pretty simple. It's in brain surgery to figure out what makes a successful nonprofit. You can see it. You can see sometimes whether there are either issues on the staff side, whether there are issues on the board side, whether there may be issues with both. But the organizations that really do well are the ones where the staff and the board work as partners to help the organization thrive. But I've seen plenty over the years where they really work well and the organization raises the money that they try to raise. They have successful fundraising campaigns, whether on an annual or a capital campaign basis. And you see it. It's simple to see. And the reason is because the board is actively engaged. They're out there setting up meetings. They're going on the meetings. They're the ones that should actually be asking for the money in the fundraising call, not the staff person. Sometimes organizations will they have a good CEO, they may have a good development person, and they just think, okay, well, those people, we've hired those people, they should be going out and raising money. It's not the way it works. It's not a fair world out there. Learned that a long time ago, too. Just because you got a great program and what you're trying to do is critically important in whatever field you're in, it doesn't mean you're going to raise money.
There seems to be like 2 or 3 or 4 major families in town that have consistently given money. We think of your family, we think of the Levines, we think of the Belks, and their name is all over the place. What do you think about this insistence on naming rights that attach with every major grant?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's kind of difficult for me to speak about it because our name is on several things around town. That being said, I do have an issue with it. I mean, that comes back to the more altruistic part of giving, and why you should be giving. No, it shouldn't be. You shouldn't be giving because your name is going to be on something. Sometimes we've been approached with that, obviously, as a way to try to entice us to give. So yeah, and again, I know how to play that game too, because again, I spend a lot of time trying to raise money. So I know if I go into somebody, the main thing when you go in to have a conversation with somebody about money, about giving money, to me is always it should be just that, a conversation. So even if I have a pretty good sense about, I'm seeing this person because I think they may have some interest in what it is I'm trying to sell, with that organization. But that being said, I've always looked at it as you really need to try to have an open conversation. So I don't try to go in with a predetermined even what the subject matter, I'm going to talk about that organization, but where that conversation might go. My goal is always to try to get people to talk to me, and so I can then gauge what they're really interested in. And there may only obviously be some aspects of what that organization is doing that they're interested in, and try to make that connection. If I'm going to be a good fundraiser, what I need to try to do is connect what that organization is really trying to do with what those people are interested in, because that's one way that you can try to guarantee that if they fund that they're going to have a good experience with that, and that they're going to, hopefully derive as much as the organization is on the other side by the money they gave. If they're giving to something they don't know much about, even if they were to agree to do it, it's going to, long term, is probably not going to be the best thing for that organization, because they're very likely not to continue to be a funder down the road because, they didn't have that connection.
But when you see the same family name on everything around town, don't you roll your eyes?
Yeah, I do roll my eyes. And I also know, I know sometimes I don't know much, and sometimes I know a good bit about what went behind those naming gifts, And so I know that maybe some of them didn't happen except for the fact that name was going to be involved. And no, in a perfect world, I would sit here and tell you that I don't think that that's the highest level of giving, as Maimonides might have talked about. That being said, if that's the only way, I can't blame the organization. If that's the only way they see that they're going to get a gift of the magnitude to do that, Now, again, some organizations sometimes undersell it. They really should probably ask for more. If somebody's name's going to be on a major building around town, well, maybe they should have gotten more money, than they got. So, again, it'd be great if we lived in a perfect world. We don't. And so I sort of understand why it happens, but no, I sometimes don't like it either, because I don't like the hoops that the organizations jump through, in order to get the gift that may have put a name on a building. That being said, you would hope that over time it might spur some other names around town, because again, there are a lot of other people whose names aren't a whole lot around town. They got a lot of resources.
Philip, let's talk about your life. Many people know the Blumenthal name, as we just talked about, but don't know the story of the family. How do you tell that story?
Well, a lot of it comes, it is very tied to ultimately our involvement in philanthropy in the community. My grandparents, both my mother's and father's family, were from Eastern Europe. So their parents were from Lithuania, Russia, Poland, and Germany. And they all came over, and they all actually ended up in Savannah, Georgia. So my father's family, his father came over with 2 brothers. They were in New York, and they landed in Savannah, Georgia, on a quest for an opportunity they heard about in Key West, and there was a yellow fever quarantine, and everybody had to get off the train in Savannah, so that's how they ended up there. And I'm not sure exactly how my mother's family ended up there, but they were there too. And they were very involved in the community. So they came over, like most people who came in that time, in the probably late 1800s, 1880s probably, with nothing. And they were very successful in Savannah, my father's family. Mother's family moved away at a pretty early age, and then grew up on the West Coast, actually, in L.A. And her grandfather, because of uncles that she had, helped him get into the movie business. And he was actually a casting director for Columbia Pictures and then Walt Disney when we were growing up. But my father's family, had stayed. So I had a lot of relatives in Savannah. And my grandparents became very philanthropic. And they passed that on to my uncle, who was very much that way. And then, of course, to my parents and to me. So we very much look at it as, this is a legacy. It's very much part of our heritage that you are truly supposed to be involved in the community that you live in.
There is a business behind it all.
Yeah.
And there is an origin story behind how your uncle started the business. I was wondering if you might share that story.
Yeah, he was, when my father was born, my uncle was 21. So he was grown, and he was, I think, really looking for new opportunities. And my grandfather had started what was a very successful 5 and 10 cent store on one of the main corners in downtown Savannah, and had done really well with that. And he owned a lot of properties in Savannah and stuff, but he really wasn't interested, I don't think, in expanding beyond that. My uncle was, very entrepreneurial and had a lot of energy, and he happened to be passing through Charlotte and had a leak in the radiator in his car, which at the time was a big deal because you had to tear the engine apart, take the radiator out, have it soldered by a tinsmith, and then put it all back together again. So he was told, though, when he had this leak by a gentleman about a product that could be put into his radiator and just into the water that would go to that leak and seal it. And you would then not have to go through that whole process, which was very costly and time consuming. So he used it, and it was called solder seal, and it was a powder radiator stop leak. So he thought this was great, and it had been developed by a company that actually still exists in Charlotte today. It was a roofing company because that's who most of the tinsmiths were, so it made sense. His name was G.G. Ray, and G.G. Ray Roofing Company still exists. So he ultimately went into business with Mr. Ray because Mr. Ray really wasn't interested in the automotive application as much. And he became a salesman and sold it out of the trunk of his car, and not too long after bought Mr. Ray out of that business. And that was the first product of our company, which is Radiator Specialty Company. And that's where the name came from. So since that time, the company's grown, and we make a whole range of products for cars as well as, and we sell under 2 main brands at this point, Gunk and Liquid Wrench. We have some others too, but under the Gunk brand, it's really a lot of cleaners, degreasers, and products like that. We also then, under Liquid Wrench, there's a lot of automotive products, a lot of lubricants and penetrants are sold under that brand. And then what we hope is going to become probably the biggest part of the business one of these days is we call RSC Bio Solutions, where a lot of these products are now bio-based. And that's what we hope ultimately is going to, again, be the future, where all our products will be bio-based products instead of petroleum-based.
Your uncle's name was I.D. Blumenthal,
yeah,
and your dad's name was Herman Blumenthal.
Right.
And your dad eventually ran the company.
Right, he did. So my uncle ran it for, a long time, and then he had other interests. And my father, when we were just kids, took over, and then he ran the company for many, many years.
What comes to mind when you think of your father, Herman Blumenthal?
It's actually interesting. My father and even my uncle, they were very different personalities. My uncle was sort of the salesman type in a lot of ways, very outgoing and stuff. And my father was too, but my father was in a lot quieter way. So when I think of my father, he was a very strong individual, very strong-willed, which I think ran in their whole family. Stubbornness is another word for it. But my father, though, was much quieter in the way that he did things.
Did you know your uncle, I.D.?
Oh, yeah. No, very well. Yeah, I was in my late 20s when he passed away, and he was also my godfather. He and my aunt were my godparents. He had no children of his own. So one of the things he did, where I used to spend a good bit of time with him, but growing up, he had started, there was no Jewish home for the aged between Richmond and Atlanta. And so he had the idea, and he was looking for a place, and he found this property near Winston-Salem in Clemens. And he bought this property, about 120-something acres, and started what became, you're talking about naming things for people, it was originally a North Carolina Jewish Home for the Aged, but not long before he passed away, the board really wanted to name it for him, so it was called the Blumenthal Jewish Home for the Aged. It since really doesn't exist in its current form anyway, in its form that it did, and a foundation has been set up to sort of carry on the work of helping, Jewish seniors. But I spent a lot of time. He would drive around the state raising money from different people in a lot of these communities, where they had small Jewish populations and stuff. So I used to drive him around the state a good bit raising money.
Your dad has quite a philanthropic record. Obviously, the Blumenthal Foundation, Carolina Agency for Jewish Education, the Wildacres Retreat, the Shalom Park campus.
Yeah.
He was the founding president of the park.
Yeah.
And he was served as president of Temple Beth El and the Jewish Community Center.
Yeah. No, he was very, very involved. Both my parents were. My mother was too, in a lot of different organizations. And his focus wasn't totally in the Jewish community, but it largely was. And Jewish education was something that was always really important, both to my uncle and my father, and then to us too. So yeah, he started what was the Carolina Agency for Jewish Education, which is now part of the library at Shalom Park. But he also had this idea, and he and a small group of guys that started Shalom Park, which was a huge undertaking in that a lot of people had to be convinced, number one, that it was a good idea, because they looked at it in some ways as, some of them weren't that far removed from the ghettos in Eastern Europe, and so do you really want like the whole Jewish community all on one campus like that? So there was that issue. There was the issue of a lot of the institutions that are all out there, whether they would lose their autonomy, and their identity and those sort of issues that had to be worked through. So it was a real sort of feat to pull all those people together to realize that it would really be a great thing for the community, and it has been. It has been for the Jewish community to the point where, a lot of people from all over the country, from different communities, have come to really study it and see how it works.
When you think of being Jewish in Charlotte, what comes to mind?
Well, it's probably changed somewhat over time. When we were kids, growing up, obviously, I went to public school, and I could be in a lot of classrooms where I was the only Jewish person. So whereas, it's not the same thing as being racially different, where you sort of, there's this obvious difference, but there was, And so we were very aware of the fact that it was different. And so there was always a challenge, probably in the South more than most other places in the country, to sort of maintain your Jewish identity. Because if you're not Jewish, I don't think you think about how overwhelming it can be, particularly around, say, Christmas, for example. And it's sort of a well-known fact now that the holiday Hanukkah is really not that major. Never was that major a holiday in Judaism, but it's become more major just really as almost a defense mechanism around Christmas, because Christmas can be so overwhelming. You can't turn on the radio, you can't get in an elevator, you can't go anywhere in public, and it's just Christmas music, for like a month and a half straight, and that's all you hear. And it's like, if that's not your religion, then obviously you look at it differently than if it is. And so I think that it used to be more of a challenge than it is now. I think now the city has gotten a lot more diverse, and so, you don't really even think about it that much anymore. But I know a lot of people, particularly in the North, didn't even think that there were any Jews in the South, much less that they had thriving Jewish communities. So I think that part is probably part of what drove both my parents and my aunt and uncle and other people too, not just them, but in Charlotte and in other southern cities, to really focus on building a strong Jewish identity. And that it was really important, because otherwise it could be lost very quickly. I mean, my father was raised Orthodox, and so was my uncle, obviously, and that was a very Orthodox home that they lived in Savannah. I mean, both my uncle and my father, their two main synagogues then, still the two biggest ones, are both are Temple Israel Conservative and Temple Bethel Reform. And so both my uncle and father belonged to both of them. But my father really was at Temple Bethel, and my uncle really was at Temple Israel. So they sort of spread it around a little bit. But yeah, I think my father sort of rebelled against some of the, the observances and the strict observance. And so we sort of came from that. So yeah, I come from a very Reformed background.
What was your relationship with your father growing up?
Oh, I think it was good. I mean, I think, understood each other pretty well. I think he had a good relationship with all three of us. I have two brothers. I'm in the middle, so that always colors, where you're born. I was a typical middle child. So,
how did that show up, being a typical middle child?
Well, I think, when you're a middle child, you sort of see things differently. The firstborn, looks at the world in sort of the way firstborns will or have a tendency to. And then the youngest, however many there are, whoever's the youngest, I think, tends to get away with more. It's easy for me to look at it that way, just because they're the last and the parents have sort of now been through this before. And so the middle, it's not that you're the forgotten child necessarily, but you learn different skills, I think, maybe sometimes that the others don't necessarily think about as much.
What skills were those for you?
Well, it's sort of more mediation. You sort of can understand your older and younger siblings, maybe in a different way than they look at each other, maybe, or even look at you. But that's just sort of being in the middle, sort of that teaches you that as you grow up.
Did you feel any pressure as your father's son to be a certain way or to live a certain life?
Not to be a certain way or live a certain life. I think there's certain expectations, though, of our family. There's no question, now a lot of people, they obviously don't know what they did in Savannah, but they certainly knew my uncle was involved in things very early on here. And civically he was, and so was my father. And so there was some pressure, I would say, that you do have a responsibility to, again, sort of to be involved and to really try to be as much a part of the community as you can be.
If you weren't a Blumenthal, would you be doing what you're doing now?
Some of what I'm doing now. If I weren't a Blumenthal, no, I wouldn't be running Blumenthal Foundation. I wouldn't be, the director of Wildacres Retreat in all probability. But what I would be doing is a lot of probably the conservation environmental work, because that's where my interest really, as I grew older and lived in the mountains for a long time, when I got out of college and stuff, where a lot of that came from. So I think that probably would have come through anyway.
What comes to mind when you think of your mother?
My mother was actually just a very genteel person. She was very quiet. She had a really beautiful singing voice and was a singer when my father first met her out in California, a professional singer. And but my mother was actually very dedicated to my father in a lot of ways, and she was a very strong-willed person too, and was very involved, organizationally with different organizations and did a lot of stuff. But I think she did look at herself as being supportive for him and a lot of the things. And she was very involved, too, with Wildacres, with the foundation, too. She was on the foundation board also.
How is it that Blumenthal Performing Arts is named after your family?
Well, there was some talk for a long time in the community when it was being built and who would give the lead gift. And obviously it was built, where the belt department store was, so they were very involved. And my father was somewhat involved in that conversation about who it would be named for, and he was then approached, would he be interested in being that lead gift? And so we talked about it, as a family.
Do you remember that conversation?
Oh, yeah. No, I remember it really well because, we had been involved, again, through the foundation as a family for a long time. The question is, do you want to be involved at this level? Because there are not all positives necessarily associated with that, not least of which is, you do that, and then, of course, all these other organizations have these expectations. Oh, well, maybe they'll do that for us too. And again, back to part of early in the conversation, we do only have so much in the way of resources. So there are only so many gifts like that are going to happen. So I would say that it was that kind of pressure that we talked about. It was not that we didn't care. We've always, parents in our family, and my wife's a professional musician, so yeah, we've always been very close and very involved in the arts, in Charlotte and other places too. But the question became, okay, is this something that you want to do in a leadership role, and what is that going to then do, as far as expectations for the future? And at the bottom line, obviously, we decided it was a good decision to make, and we were very happy with that decision. It was where it needed to be, which is downtown, which is something that I think is very important, that you have a very alive and thriving downtown, and it be the living room of the region. It's actually very important environmentally that be the case. And so things like that happening down there are really critical. So even 25 years, this is the 25th year of the Performing Arts Center. That was being talked about then as being a real sort of key to the development of downtown. So, yeah, for all the right reasons, we thought that it would be a good thing to do. And as far as pressure, we had the foundation obviously anyway. So it was sort of like, if you put your sort of shingle out with a foundation on it, you're going to hear from a lot of people anyway. So it didn't really change that one way or the other.
What's it like walking into a building and seeing your name on it?
Well, we're very proud of it. We're very proud of the way it's run and what it's meant for the community. And we go to a lot of performances, of different kinds of performances. So we've always found it very gratifying, too, that you walk in and you see people, it could be from a symphony to one of the other plays to one of the other jazz things, whatever it might be, that you see totally different crowd of people, which is great. I think they've done a very good job of appealing to a wide range of people. But, both who they bring in, the price point of tickets and all this kind of stuff, that it's been a very rewarding thing to be involved with.
There are families in town with famous last names. You have one of them. What's it like growing up with a famous last name? Well,
I think hopefully it's made us behave a little bit better. Not that we would have misbehaved that much, but I do think that, there's a certain responsibility that, that you got not just to yourself, but to your family. And again, it doesn't mean that we're so great or that we do everything right all the time or whatever, but I do think it makes you kind of more aware of that you do have a place in the community and that, and that hopefully what you're trying to do is important and impactful. And
do you ever think people approach you differently on a personal level because of your last name?
yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's no question that that's the case. So I think you have to sometimes sort of try to filter that out a little bit. You know, I mean, one thing that it's done is, yeah, it might make you a little more, I won't say leery, but maybe that's not a bad word, you know, of people and what they may want sometimes. Yeah, because you know that you are known as being a giver and involved with philanthropy in the community. So yeah, there are a lot of times people want to meet you. We've been involved in other things too, including politics. So yeah, there's no question that a lot of times, you know, people want that introduction. They want to meet you because they basically want something. You know, the question is that something we want to give and be involved with, whether it's philanthropically or politically or any other way? And so you just have to sort of filter that out of the conversation when you're trying to, you know, have a conversation with somebody.
Do you think people with famous last names are more comfortable with other people with famous last names because they get it?
I mean, I think that that's true sometimes, although in some cases I would rather it not be. I mean, I'd rather be, because, you know, you travel a lot, you know, you're someplace else where other people have absolutely no idea your involvement or not in Charlotte, North Carolina. You know, that, yeah, sometimes it can be a little more liberating to be in a conversation with somebody that has no idea what, you know, who you are or where you come from. And, you know, so it sort of makes the conversation sometimes a little more pure.
Where did you go to school?
Well, I went to public schools in Charlotte. You know, went to Eastover, AG in Myers Park, you know, and then went to university in Chapel Hill.
Did the family business interest you?
It interested me from a sort of a family enterprise point of view, you know, and I was always very proud of our business and what we did, and that we were a family-owned business that hopefully treated our employees well, but not as far as where I wanted to make my career doing.
Which was?
Well, what I was looking at, as I was getting older, I was always very interested in science. And so I would probably have gone somewhere in that direction. I was very fortunate in a couple of ways. One was with Wildacres, that I spent a lot more time at Wildacres growing up. So Wildacres is a conference center in Little Switzerland, near Little Switzerland, about 3 miles from downtown Little Switzerland, the community, where we have groups come up. Most of them are basically nonprofits, or they're technically nonprofits, but a lot of them at least operate sort of on a nonprofit basis. We subsidize, you know, what happens at Wildacres every year, but for about 7 months every year, from early April to usually early November, we have groups every day come and stand for anywhere from a couple of nights to a week or so, and having nonprofit educational programs. So that can be music, art, writing. Can be everything from an African drum and dance camp to an oncology nursing society to the North American Mycological Association, which is mushrooms and fungi. So it's all types of things that come up there, and they come up there and we provide our facilities and they have their programs. And this coming season will be our 73rd year. So we've been doing it a long time. Again, this is something my uncle was involved with. He sort of stumbled into this property in 1936 and was able to buy it for next to nothing, which is another interesting story how he was able to get it. He always said God gave it to him. He didn't believe he really bought it. He paid about $6,500 for what he thought was 1,400 acres. And then we had added over the years another couple hundred acres, but we actually just put it into a conservation easement. Most of the property we just finished the end of December, actually. And so about 1,100 acres is now in a conservation easement, which will protect it from development forever. And then we've kept some of the top of the mountain and other parts that we really use a lot out of the easement. But there's probably about 1,200 acres. But he always thought it was about 1,400 acres. But he was able to buy that for $6,500 in 1936. So he always said God gave it to him, and he really believed that. It took about 10 years for him to sort of figure out what to do with it. My father, who was in his early 20s then, went up there. They painted the buildings and fixed them up, the two original buildings that have since been torn down, and ran a little summer hotel for a few years. And then during the war, it was leased to the Ringling School of Art and Design in Sarasota, and they used it for their summer campus. So they would come up and bring people, students, and they would be up there for about 8 or 10 weeks in the summertime. And it was after that my uncle and father decided they wanted to really share it with more people. So in 1946, it was dedicated to the betterment of human and interfaith relations. And ever since that time, we've operated on that basis. So from 1946, this will be our 73rd season. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a very fulfilling thing. So I had grown up with my brothers, never spent a whole lot of time up there, but I had grown up. Through several summers, I worked different jobs up there. And so it was very fortunate for me right after I graduated that we needed somebody to run it. And so I said I would be interested because, again, it would be living in the mountains and doing that, and it was a very worthwhile and fulfilling thing to do. So I started running it. This will be my 43rd year running it, right after I got out of college, and then lived up there most of the time for 15 years. But it's again, very rewarding to have people that you've had a relationship with, and sometimes be 30, 40, 50 years that have been coming to Wildacres. And they feel very, very close to the place, and they very much look at it like they're coming home. And they tell us all the time. So we like that aspect of it too, as well as having, new and interesting programs.
Your passion is the environment and conservation.
Well, growing up, I always was tended towards science and natural sciences. And then when I lived at Wildacres, I became even a lot more aware of forestry issues, around clean air and clean water issues. And so then when I no longer lived at Wildacres and I really had to, get civilized and got married and buy a house in Charlotte and all that stuff, I then began to see it even in Charlotte, a lot of those issues. Because, there's a lot of good that's happened with our growth and there's a lot that's not so good. And so we're now trying to play catch up here in Charlotte, for example, with open space issues, things like the Greenway, which are so important. So I was very involved with the Carolina Thread Trail and from the beginning of that and organizations like that. So I get involved with a lot of different environmental organizations in a lot of different ways. So whether it's things like, the Sierra Club or Environmental Defense Fund or Nature Conservancy, different ways, Wilderness Society, or much smaller organizations that work really at the very local scale, that's always been my interest.
Philip, you've won many awards, including the Order of the Longleaf Pine, Conservationist of the Year by the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. How do you feel when you win an award?
Well, it's gratifying that you're recognized for what you do, but it's like, and I don't mean to diminish the importance of awards. I sort of know why they're done. Of course, a lot of times they're done by organizations as fundraisers. They use that. A lot of it happens here in Charlotte that way too. So I think that when people get awards, you'd like to think that whatever they did was worthy of an award. I'm not so sure that's true all the time. And in my case, I'm not. I'm just trying to, at the end of the day, on a personal level, we were talking about philanthropically, you want to make sure that you're having impact or the desired impact, or again, at least learn something from the money that you give away. Well, I feel that way with time too. So as you get older, that becomes more important as a matter of fact. And so you see some of the same issues environmentally that we've been talking about for a long time. So there becomes sort of a greater sense of urgency about what you're doing as you get older, because you realize, well, maybe you don't have all the time in the world to try to help solve some of these issues. That's where my interest really sort of comes over time. I don't think we have a lot of time to solve some of the problems that we're facing. Charlotte, for example, taking Charlotte as an example, I think we're getting better at some of those issues. I think we're realizing that we don't have all the water in the world. You used to talk about water quality in Charlotte, not water quantity. Well, quantity is an issue now too, as we're one of the fastest growing regions in the country. So we need to be smarter about it. We can be. We waste so much. Air is another issue, and they're trying to address it. Open space is another. When you look at a lot of other cities, they've been a lot smarter than we have about planning open space and shared open space. People will be willing to live in a lot higher density if they have that shared open space. And a lot of this isn't something that is original even with conservationists now. You can go to a lot of the European cities that have been there for thousands of years, and they figured it out a long time ago that you need to have attractive open spaces. Even the sidewalks when you're walking down in most European cities are so much more attractive. They make them places that you want to be in and you feel comfortable in. That's what it's about. It's about building things to the human scale and having them as attractive places that people want to be. And so I don't think a lot of it is, again, I don't think it's complex. I don't think it's difficult to figure out, but it does require a community having sort of the will to say, we can be better than we are right now. We can do better. And that's what we should do.
Philip, your parents passed a legacy down to you. What is the legacy you hope to pass on?
Well, I hope it's similar to what was passed on to me. I mean, I think my kids have, in their generation, their cousins, I think, very much feel, we actually have family meetings twice a year where everybody's invited. If everybody doesn't show up, they don't show up, but they're all invited to come and sit down and talk about everything. So we talk about the business, and we talk about the foundation, and we talk about Wildacres, and we talk about everything. And so we've done it, and we do it twice a year, and I think that helps build sort of a family relationship, if you will, and sort of some of the common values that we all sort of grew up with, at least my brothers and I did. I think the succeeding generation, and now even, I mean, my kids are 27 and 25, but they've got some cousins that are now in their 40s, you know, who have kids. And so it's now it's even a younger generation of that. And hopefully, you know, that sort of family ethic will be passed along, and it's basically this. I mean, to me, it's not about money. If some of them didn't have any money, that's not really what it's about. I mean, I think what it really is about is being actively involved in your community wherever you happen to live, and really being part and giving whatever it is you have to give. And if that's money, that's great. But if it's not money, then it can be time, and it can be energy, and it can be your intellect. If you want to understand what makes a community successful, it's people that really care about it. And so wherever you happen to be, I mean, I think that's what's important in having people understand that it's not about money a lot of times. It really isn't, you know. So that's why sometimes I wish that we had more money to be able to grant, because I see the need with organizations that we really know well, and I wish we had more that we could do for them. But at another level, it's not so much about the money. It's about trying to help develop a sense of caring about the issues, realizing that things can always be better, no matter how good they are. You know, nobody's reached perfection just yet. And that being the case, that if you can be better, why shouldn't you try to do that? And realizing the only way that's going to happen is if you're involved.
Phil, thank you so much for your time.
No, you're welcome.
Philip Blumenthal is chairman and director of the Blumenthal Foundation and director of Wildacres Retreat. He earned a BA in Business Administration from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And now, a personal word. I interviewed Philip in a conference room beside his office. I was immediately struck by the images on the wall. Portraits of Philip's father, Herman Blumenthal, and his uncle, I.D. Blumenthal, and black and white photographs of his grandparents and ancestors in Orthodox religious garb. I sensed the tradition and legacy of the family, the stories and expectations passed on, the history of entrepreneurism and faith and philanthropy. I thought of my own father and how much he might have in common with Philip. My dad was similarly born to a successful Jewish family with a notable last name in his community. Not in the United States, but in Brazil. In the late 1800s, during the first Amazon rubber boom, when the extraction and commercialization of rubber transformed the Amazon basin, Sephardic Jews from Morocco and Gibraltar joined waves of Europeans who migrated to the Amazon rainforest to find their fortune. Jewish immigrants brought with them their education and religion and entrepreneurial drive. I can only imagine the negotiation of cultures as these European North African Jews found their way among Brazilians and indigenous populations in patches of clearing that became urbanized small towns beside one of the mightiest rivers on the planet in the lush and heat and verdant density of the tropics. My grandfather, Isaac Jose Perez, became a landowner and merchant in the town of Itacoatiara near the city of Manaus, operating a business that extracted latex from rubber trees that he shipped to Europe and later North America. My grandfather was among those civic leaders and prominent men of the rubber industry who brought electricity and running water and modern amenities to the region. He contributed to arts and culture, to roads and infrastructure, to the honoring and preservation of the Jewish community. A lifelong philanthropist, he was appointed mayor of his city in 1926, and during his tenure, he embarked on an environmental and beautification program, including a grand avenue that was later named after him that people from around the world visit to this day. My grandfather had many children. My father, Ambrosio Benchimol Bettis, was the youngest son. My dad was interested in the success of the family enterprise, but not in joining the business. Instead, he was interested in traveling the world and forging his own way in the United States. My father emigrated to New York in 1954. He met my mom, a Roman Catholic young woman 19 years younger than him, on a return visit to Brazil in 1955. They met at a carnival party in the northern Brazilian city of São Luís. They married that year, she moved with him back to New York, and their journey as Brazilian Americans began. They would move from New York to New Orleans to San Francisco, where I was born in 1962. My father occasionally went to temple on the high holy days, but he did not practice Judaism. My brothers and sisters and I were all raised Roman Catholic by my mom. But our household was Jewish in temperament, at least to the extent that we valued learning and education and good storytelling and hard work. I love that my last name is Bettis. All those memories and feelings came back when I saw the photographs of generations of the Blumenthal family in Philip's conference room. Philip and his family have made remarkable and lasting contributions to our region. We are so much better as a community when legacies are created and traditions of generosity are passed on. This is Mark Paris, and you've been listening to On Life and Meaning. Thank you to my partners Andy Go, producer of the show, and to Chris Curriton, art and media director. This is how you can help. Please write a review on iTunes. It helps us grow our audience. Follow us on Facebook. We'd love to hear what you think about the show. And become a patron. We are on Patreon, a crowdsourcing platform that allows you to support what you value. Visit us also on our website, onlifeandmeaning.com. Thank you for listening.